Always curious, Professor George Washington Carver committed his life to scholarship, community, and the integration of his Christian faith with higher education. It's in this spirit we welcome you to Carver Classrooms. Hi there. Thanks for making it this far. In our first class, we asked the question, what is art? And in the last video, we explored the why behind art making. In this class, we're going to explore some practicalities, the how of art making. The question I hear all the time when people figure out I teach a class on art and the church is, so do you think art making can be worship? Or more practically, and probably what they really mean is, how do we use art in the church besides liturgical banners? And again, I'm a huge fan of liturgical banners. But before we go to answer that question, I want to start with this German word that I really should not try to pronounce. Maybe we'll just show it on the screen. The closest English translation to that phrase is total art. Now, total art is a work of art that makes use of multiple forms, many different aspects of art making to achieve its goals. Wagner really made it popular in the 19th century as he was talking about the decline of the opera in his day. And we have good examples actually today of what total art might be. And imagine a complete experience of both sounds, visuals, environment, everything adding up to the experience of a piece of art. Like, this is a popular example for total art. Imagine seeing a performance in the interior of the Palau da Musica Catalina in Barcelona. Or imagine attending Catholic Mass at Notre Dame. Or in a more modern context, many people cite the original release of Star Wars as a perfect example of total art. So now if we move back to this phrase of art versus maybe Christian art, does that change the criteria of what a total art experience would be? Is there something about Christian art that adds a new value to what would be total art? Let's use this framework from Francis Schaeffer's seminal book, Escape from Reason. Francis Schaeffer says, ever since the Enlightenment, the human mind has been taught to divide itself between these two poles. No longer are we one united consciousness. We are now a sacred mind and a secular mind. In this schism, we put faith in the upper story, and we put reason in the lower story. And the modern mind does not allow those two things to mix with a lot of fluidity. This sacred secular schism is something that we still feel today. And in fact, if you extrapolate that, in the upper story, you have things that are fanciful, weird, unproven, abstract. And in the lower story, you have things that are literal and practical and useful and grounded. This science versus faith divide is very interesting when we apply it to art in the church, because there's a tension when we approach finding a place for art inside the church body. And in the context of a church worship service especially, the world outside the church might see faith as not based in facts or science, but belief. And yet the secular world would be much more open to the idea of representing something abstract like faith in a non-representational aesthetic. But often inside the Western evangelical context, it is the opposite. The church is not the place for the metaphorical or the weird, especially visually, but only practical expressions of spreading the gospel or keeping the church on brand and on mission. Questions are often asked when art enters the church. How many souls can be saved if we waste $1,000 on this oil painting that's going to hang in the narthex? But it is not a zero-sum game. The church in body and building can be a vessel for beauty. So what should be the goals for art in the church? I have a message for two different groups before we start. First of all, the church body at large should seek to include diverse artistic voices and stories into all aspects of church life. And secondly, artists, you should really guard yourself against being snobs and total elites when it comes to art in the church. This tendency to become a snob is so common in almost all professions that we must humble ourselves when we want to bring other people to learn about our discipline and our passions. Now, the church should absolutely include artists' voices and stories into all aspects of its life. And in fact, the framework we used from the previous video of artifact, process, and experience can be used to help us explore that. So, artifacts. The church should invest in beauty that is unusual. We know how to do usual beauty. We don't know how to do unusual beauty. Of course, there are examples of great artifacts making their way into church services. Banners, liturgical expressions, paintings. Here's an image of a Mako Fujimura painting hanging in a sanctuary. Or creating installations, things that actually activate the visual presence of the sanctuary or the worship space. Process. Now, the church could build a community that makes things together. What does it mean to incorporate artists into the process of church life? That could be something as simple as design thinking and welcoming artists and designers into the decision-making process where they can use what they do well: iteration, trial and error, data gathering, human-centered design. These are all things the church could benefit from. Or even something like an artist in residence. Here's an example of a church in New Orleans who offers a space inside their building for artists to live and work and to become part of the visual fabric of the life of a church, embodying a space and becoming part of that church's life. And finally, experience. The church should create surprising and beautiful encounters. So what could that look like? I think about Sarah Groves and Charlie Peacock, who built Art House Nashville and Art House North. And they're a group that encourages and equips people to make stuff inside the context of church. They've inhabited old church buildings and had community concerts and workshops and places for people to make stuff together. Or even the Rabbit Room out of Nashville, which is an organization that cultivates and curates stories, music, and art to nourish Christians and Christ-centered communities throughout the world. Some examples of things that touch all three of those aspects in church life could be a church making a community mural or a church garden. How can people within the context of Jesus have both artifact, process, and experience together? So when we return back to this idea of total art, in the context of a Christian environment, perhaps we can reframe that as total worship. Yes, art making can be worship, but I don't think we get to total worship unless we include the gifts from every believer into that process of worship. As we revisit these ideas of artifact, process, and experience, it's interesting how they easily map on to ideas of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. In her book, Mind of the Maker, Dorothy Sayers equates the artistic process and expression with the Trinity. She calls the Father the origin of the idea or the logos, the thing that comes to us that we want to make. And the Son, Jesus, represents the manifestation of that work, the fleshing out of that idea. And all incarnation comes with pain and suffering. It's hard to make things. It's hard to be human. And finally, the Holy Spirit. That maps on to the power and the effect that the art has in the world. The power that the idea of the Father gives us, lived out into the Son, the fleshing out of that idea translates to a power that we don't understand and can't exactly pinpoint. And I love this idea of the way art making, when it's at its best, reflects the gifts of the Trinity. In fact, Madeleine L'Engle said, all true art is incarnational. And finally, before we end, it's my belief that this Walter Wangerin Jr. quote represents the secret about art making in the context of church community. That art is not art until it is experienced by another. Thanks for watching these classes. I hope these ideas can be helpful to better enjoy the process of making art, or looking at art, or perhaps even creating a space for art inside your Christian community. Thank you.